Okay, with that said, I'm happy to introduce today's panel, looking at the G7, as well as the Global South and the future of multilateralism and climate cooperation. I'm more than pleased to be joined by, a very great table of colleagues, including High Commissioner Riyaz Sheikh of the Republic of South Africa, who will be delivering today's opening remarks. I will be brief in terms of my introductions, but the High Commissioner has been in office here in Ottawa for the past couple of years and has held senior roles at the Republic of South Africa through its presidency, as well as in the diplomatic service, including in the past in Germany, as well as Algeria. And today he will be speaking to an important angle of this discussion, which is South Africa's G20 presidency and sort of its mirror image and reflections on Canada's G7 presidency, as both sort of groups work on these issues of multilateralism and climate cooperation at an increasingly tense moment in our international community. So with that said, I do want to hand off the remarks now to High Commissioner Riyaz Sheikh, and then we can follow accordingly. So High Commissioner, it's all yours.
Thank you, Johnson. So let me thank the Institute for hosting this event. I've participated in previous events, and so thank you very much. I'll cut to the chase. A couple of things. I'm scheduled to be with you for an hour, then I have to leave. I hope to listen to all of the comments before I do that. I looked at the topic and I think it's really a fantastically considered topic. Climate cooperation in crises, because I think, yes, the word crisis is crucially important in our political language of today. The G7 is an important arrangement of multilateralism, the Global South, and in the shifting order, yes, because I think that's exactly correct, that we get a sense that something is shifting and we are in what some people will call the interregnum. We are in this period where the old is dying and the new is not yet born. And this is not to say that the old is good or bad or the new is going to be good or bad. We just know that there is this feeling that fundamental change seems to be unraveling at in tremendous speed. And of course, this has been accelerated by what is going on south of the border in respect how the United States is defining for itself its own image and what it wants to do in the world. And that is having a major ripple effect all over the world. So what we do know is that the old order that we've all assumed to be the liberal international order is seeming to reach a particular point in which it is absolutely fracturing and it is creaking. But let me just say that while that may be the experience of the Western international liberal order, the experience of the Global South is quite opposite to that. Because if you take the 70 years in which the global North has been moving in a particular direction of integration to disintegration, the Global South has been moving in the other direction from colonialism, etc., which was periods of destabilization, and they now seem to be moving into an area of integration, be it either in BRICS, be it in ASEAN, be it the way they are speaking in different formations. It would reflect an integration. This is not to say that they are going to solve all the challenges they face, but I just wanted to highlight the point that there are two different points of references. While the global North is feeling a sense of disintegration, the global South is feeling a sense of integration. And we need to keep this in mind as we listen to voices. But I want to make just an important couple of points. The first point is the role of agency in change. And I think this is an important point in the context of what I call the violence problematic, where, as legitimate protests are getting looked at from the lens of an illegal point of view, voices are being shut down, universities are being trampled upon. The whole role of being agents of progressive change becomes a fundamentally important thing. Now, in the global south and in South Africa, we see ourselves as an agent of progressive change. We see ourselves as a government, as a people who seek the path of navigational praxis, where praxis is a combination of our thought and action, and navigational in the sense that we exercise agency in a manner that expands the possibility space for a better world. So that we are not ashamed of it. And increasingly, despite all attempts to make us more polite on this matter, whilst we may not be vulgar, we're not going to give up the right to say that we are agents of progressive change, and we do, in fact, want to engage with all the matters that the globe confronts in a progressive mindset. So we also start from the basis that the world has entered a kind of polycrisis. And again, for the want of a better word, this polycrisis is a protracted phase of critical transition and turbulence that is unfolding simultaneously across multiple subsystems of the world, of the earth system, the political economies, to finance, to climate, to biodiversity, to energy, to food, to disease, to global security, and including identity. So there is this transition towards multiple crises interacting with each other, presenting essentially what we call a polycrisis. But underlying the polycrisis is three very important problematics that we need to understand. The first is a sociological problematic, and that is the crisis of capitalism. Now, the model by which we have worked on, the trickle-down economics, the Thatcherism, that the market will take care of everything, while we're finding that that is not turned out to be true, because inequality within countries is increasing, inequality between countries are increasing. And this is not to argue that we do not want to live in an interdependent world. Yes, we want to live in an independent world, and we would want to see what we would argue for globalization 2.0 that addresses the ills of globalization 1.0. But more importantly, we need to understand that can we continue with the model of capitalism that we've understood, and let's be quite frank about it, that is fossil fuel capitalism. Fossil fuel capitalism has been driving the anthropogenic effects. We see it in climate change. If anyone wants to doubt, just look to the prairies where the wildfires are occurring. And this is going to be a regular occurrence that's going to be happening, because climate change is not something that is going to happen. Climate change is happening. And of course, I will come to how we deal with this matter. The second problematic is the violence problematic, which I alluded to before. And there is a series of geopolitical conflicts. Militarization is taking place in war. Just look at how everyone is going to be spending 2%, 3%, 4%, 5% of GDP on militarization for war, but 0.01% on climate action change. So we are preparing for war in the midst of a climate catastrophe, and we're expecting to deal with the climate while we're preparing for war. I don't even want to talk about how the war industry contributes to climate change, but that's a topic for another. I just want to highlight the point. The next area is that, of course, we have all the technological risk, and there we have biowarfare, AI, cyber, nuclear weapons, and God forbid, if the Ukraine-Russia conflict moves into a nuclear arrangement, then we're actually talking about the destruction or catastrophic destruction of parts of the earth, which will affect all of the earth. Then I want to move to the existential problematic, which is the third problematic, and that is the whole issue of gender. There's a huge pushback, again, coming from the South about how people self-identify. It's all of these things. Identity are classified as wokeism, and anything as wokeism must be pushed back. There is the question of renewed nationalism. Every country is now trying to deal with their problems from a national lens and a national lens only, posing a false dichotomy between values and interest, and saying that you pursue your interest more than you must pursue values. And we don't think there's the dichotomy there. One can pursue values with interest. So the polycrisis is fueled by these three underlying problematics: the sociological problematic, the violence problematic, and the existential problematic. And in each of those areas, we're going to have to ask, as agents of progressive change, what is the navigational practice to move those particular problematics away from catastrophe, if it can, to the possibility space for a better world. So, in my view, and I'll end with these 2 points. One, in the absence of sustained multilateral action and authentic international cooperation to deal with the polycrisis that I've mentioned, the world is on a trajectory to a breakdown. Now, unless we intervene, and if all things remain the same, the world will head to a breakdown. There will be crises after crises, and we're going to have to manage that breakdown. So what is to be done? Well, I've listed 3 important things that, if we can do it right, will lay the basis for renewed or revitalized international cooperation for us to deal with the ills of the problematics I raised earlier. The first, every country must recommit to multilateralism. Now, you'll see I did not use the word multipolarism. I said multilateralism. I don't believe in a multipolar world because I don't know the rules of the multipolar world. I know the rules of a multilateral world. And when I mention multilateral world, I am not talking about the rules-based international order. If the rules-based international order is a subset of the multilateral world that is based on international law, I could live with that. But we've had this under the liberal world order, we've had the subset being pulled out of the rubric of multilateralism, and now has come to represent something else. But essentially, we in the global South know what the rule-based international order is. It is rules made by the global North that is imposed on the global South. And for us to say we're all happy about that, well, we're not happy about that. We want to have a multilateral order. So that's the first thing we need to do. We need to recommit to multilateralism. Second, let's just say it. Let's end all the wars. End the war in Ukraine and Russia. That matter must be resolved by the United Nations, and it must be resolved by the United Nations as soon as possible by everyone forcing Russia and Ukraine to get to the United Nations to resolve the issues. Taking both sides' issues into account, that war can be solved. It is the most unnecessary war ever in the history of mankind, of humankind. The second war related to that, and I know there may be views in Canada that is different from mine and my government on the matter. We must end the genocide in Palestine. And we must stop denying that there is no genocide taking place. We all see it, we all know it, and there's the fundamental thing that if it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, flies like a duck, it's a duck. So apply the same thing in Israel. What is happening there is unacceptable to any human being. It's unnecessary and should not happen. And Israel must be brought to account for the actions in there. This is not talking about whether Israel has the right to exist. We in South Africa have recognized Israel. We agree that they have a right to exist. But in agreeing to their right to exist, we do not agree that they have a right to commit genocide. They are a state and must be held responsible for what is happening in Palestine. So that's the second thing where I think we need action on part of the end of wars. And thirdly, and lastly, what is so difficult for all of us to renew our commitment to the Paris Agreement? Now, those who want to leave the Paris Agreement, they can leave. That's their choice. But those who want to stay in the Paris Agreement must make that agreement work. We must make that agreement work. We must have the rules to ensure that we push back and we avert, and I don't think it is possible anymore, to avert the 1.5 degree disaster that is impending. So those are my ideas. Those are my thoughts. I hope you found them useful, and I'm sorry if I came across a bit agitational.
All right, not at all. Thank you so much, High Commissioner Sheikh, and I think all of us can agree that these remarks were very much welcome for everyone here attending. And with that said, we can move on towards the panel. And, you know, in that respect, I can introduce a bit more of what will be going on today. As we all know, I'm here on the behalf of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, and our co-hosts today are Climate Action Network Canada, led by our panelists here, Carolyn Rouet. So with that said, the rest of our panelists are all distinguished and lead very much remarkable careers of their own. And I will do my best to introduce them briefly with Carolyn herself as Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada, as well as Henry Normandin, who was former Canadian ambassador and deputy permanent representative to the UN. And he had also spent some time in Beijing, where he supported the establishment of the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. And today he is a fellow at the Institut d'études internationales de Montréal, focusing on multilateralism and global governance. Moving on, we also are hosting Réseau of the Climate Hub at Asia Society and its Policy Institute, where he's also a senior fellow for the Center for China Analysis. He also served as senior global policy advisor at Greenpeace East Asia, and he's a leading voice on China's climate diplomacy. And last but not least, we have Alden Mayer, who's a senior associate at B3G, but was also a former director of strategy and policy at the Union of Concerned Scientists, where he worked for decades and has advised governments, NGOs, and UN climate talks. So I'm sure everyone here on this panel has done the same. So with that said, I do want to open up the conversation with a question that will be pertinent, given we are a week ahead of the G7 summit. As the High Commissioner had mentioned, the Paris Agreement is in a fragile place, especially given the withdrawal of the United States once more, as well as we head towards a year in which COP will be hosted by Brazil. And we have this interesting interplay between the G7 hosted by Canada this year, the G20 hosted by South Africa, and a lot of the relationships within the international community that are in tension right now are sort of in full flesh at the moment. So the question that I'd like to raise is that in this world of rising geopolitical and geoeconomic tension, and with only 5 years left in a critical decade limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, what is the state of cooperation on climate and development issues in this fragile multilateral context? So with that, I do want to perhaps hand it off to Carolyn first, and we can go from there.
Thanks so much, Johnson, and to the Institute for hosting this conversation. Excellency, thank you for these Excellent introductory remarks. I think I did not find them agitational, but rather honest and important and refreshing. So thank you for that. And thank you to my colleagues and fellow co-panelists. Really looking forward to the discussion. So as Jensen mentioned, I head Climate Action Network Canada, which is the country's largest coalition of groups working on energy and climate issues. We bring together now close to 200 organizations ranging from environmental NGOs, labor unions, First Nations, local groups, grassroots groups, and I could go on, and obviously keeping an eye and active involvement in the diplomacy space, where cooperation to achieve our joint climate objectives is absolutely crucial. And so, to your question, Johnson, I think there's a lot there, and hopefully we'll get to dive into some of the details, for instance, of where we ended after COP29 in Baku later on. But I did want to say maybe that the elephant in the room is really the US administration's kind of withdrawal for a second time from the Paris Agreement. And not only, I would say, kind of pulling back from international climate cooperation, but rather even acting destructively towards multilateral spaces in general on issues that are important and that go beyond climate action and are deeply connected to it, whether it's the rights of migrants, gender rights, but definitely on the question of climate change, we have seen this. And so that's definitely, I think, the event that has maybe had the biggest impact politically on climate cooperation, but I think also on the discourse and on how other countries are kind of thinking and seeing things, but also how it's discussed in the public eye. This said, I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves that the US obviously is a powerful country, but does not rule the world. And the Paris Agreement brings together close to 200 countries. And so while this moment comes with really key dangers and concrete impacts on lives and communities, I'm thinking, for instance, of the cuts in USAID, which have had real impacts, as well as how this impacts funding for institutions and infrastructure of climate cooperation themselves, whether we're talking about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, but also the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, where the US provides a lot of funding and also in-kind contribution to certain working groups. Again, the US does not rule the world, and we need to remember was never a constructive force on climate action. And even under Democrat administrations has often played an unhelpful role, whether we're talking about discussions on climate finance, which are a crucial part of the compromise that is the Paris Agreement. Obviously with different levels of destructiveness, I think, and Alden and Li Shuo can speak to this much better than me, how, US and China cooperation historically have really driven the outcomes that we're able to see at COPs. This is a moment where we can fully kind of grapple with that and where other countries must step up. The other point that I wanted to mention, and His Excellency referred to this, is how in this moment we're really witnessing the masks falling off in the so-called liberal world order. I think that the genocide currently happening in Gaza before our eyes really puts in perspective, and in contrast, the types of ways the G7 has been unable to mobilize in this case when we compare it, for instance, with the urge and again, the very important and valid urge with which they responded to the Russian aggression of Ukraine. And so these cracks that we're seeing are really, I think, the same cracks that we're seeing within the multilateral climate infrastructure, where we have to ask the questions of whether some interests and some lives matter more than others. I think it's perhaps a little bit facile to quote Gramsci in this moment, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. But truly, while there are some worrying trends, we also have to consider and capitalize on the generative possibilities of this moment for realignment, for new coalitions, and for the rules of multilateral cooperation, whether they are economic, financial, climate related, or even security related, are truly fit for purpose, both from a fairness, but also from the times we are in. And so I hope that we today can discuss some of those opportunities for realignment, again, in ways that are more constructive to climate action and ambition, given where we are at today, where the world is dangerously flirting with a 1.5 degrees threshold, and where we're seeing countries in the global north still failing to deliver the climate finance that they committed to. Big five countries, including Canada, still not putting forward policies that favor a transition away from fossil fuels. I'll stop there. Much more to say, but keen to hear from my co-panelists.
Thank you so much, Carol. I think you spoke about a lot of the issues that are on everyone's mind at the moment. And I did want to bring in Henry Paul, given his experience working in the UN system, as well as his overall perspective on a lot of the cracks, as Carol had mentioned, in the multilateral world, or the multilateral values that a lot of us want upheld. And we had heard a lot about the issues that are coming to the fore around the concept of a rules-based international order. And I did want to bring, again, Henry Paul's perspective on these issues in the context of climate change and climate cooperation.
Well, thank you, Janssen, and thank you to the IDP and to the Climate Action Network for organizing the discussion this afternoon. Very much appreciated. Thank you, Ambassador, as well, for your opening remarks. And I will pick up on some of that, actually, because this afternoon, of course, we're going to focus on climate. But we can't think and talk about climate without looking at the bigger picture. What the ambassador was referring to as a shifting order, we can refer to geopolitical tensions. I will start with the state of multilateralism. And if one asks, what is the state of multilateralism these days? The short answer is, it's in a tough spot. And by way of a reminder, what did multilateralism bring to the world in the last several decades? And I would put forward that it brought us two key and complementary things. First of all, it brought us rules, norms, common principles, and so on. And we tend to take that for granted, but it's not often in the history of humanity that the international community has had rules. So we've had the benefit of that, not that they're perfect, as the ambassador said, but still, it was a benefit. So rules, norms, principles. The second thing it brought us are institutions and mechanisms for cooperation to address common issues, common challenges, and this on a range of issues, from health to security to technical issues like civil aviation to the environment. So it has brought us these two things. When we look at the state of multilateralism today, we see that these two items are faltering. First of all, rules. I'll pick just three examples outside of climate. First of all, economic rules. There used to be rules under WTO, and this is being put aside by a tariff war. That's first example in the economic field. Second example, security, international security, fundamental principles of international security like sovereignty of nations and integrity of territory, are being put into question by some powers. That's pretty fundamental. And I'll give a third example, completely different one: humanitarian law. There are we still have rules for the law of the war, and we still have international humanitarian law, but it's broken in many places around the world every day, and I don't have to belabor the point. So that illustrates this tendency not to respect and abide by rules anymore. Not that it was perfect in the past. No, I won't say that. And the implementation of rules and the respect was very uneven, and it's been instrumentalized at times. But by and large, having rules is a benefit, and we're losing this benefit. In terms of cooperation, well, the political will for cooperation on common issues is weakening. In particular, since the arrival, I'm pointing to the south from where I am, since the arrival of our neighbor, the new president of the United States. So it is becoming more difficult to cooperate amongst countries to address common issues. And the instinctive reaction by many countries is, I'm going to focus on my interests, my own interests in the very short term, rather than the common interests over the long term. So this is the broad context I would submit of this shifting order. And it affects all kinds of fields of cooperation, including, of course, climate action and climate change. So this being said, we're in rough times in terms of multilateralism. What to do? I entirely agree with the ambassador and with Caroline. The ambassador said we have agency. Yes, let's use it. And we just cannot give up on multilateralism. Why? There's just no alternative. I mean, bilateral work and agreements on the side here and there will not lead us to where we have to go. So we need to pursue multilateralism. This being said, multilateralism is going to change. You know, the generation of people like me who built and practiced multilateralism, that was then, but we have to take stock of what's happening now, and we're going to have to be innovative, opportunistic, strategic in how we play out the world of multilateralism. Of course, nothing replaces the UN and the Paris Agreement, but there are other forums and bodies as well that can enable cooperation on climate change. G20 is an obvious one, but we'll get to talk about that later. But my main point here is we have to pursue multilateralism, but we'll have to reinvent it to some extent. And that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon in various ways. And as I think about reinventing, realigning, as Caroline was saying, we will count also on a new generation of people like some of our panelists today to do precisely that. So I'll leave it at that for now, and we'll come back to other issues later on.
All right. I would also like to bring in Réseau at this point to talk about sort of an unspoken actor in all this discussion, whether it's in the G7, G20, or even just the climate context multilaterally, which is China, and to what extent that is an important point that we will be discussing in a lot more depth, both this year and the years to come. I mean, we are looking at, for example, current talks between the US and China on economic reconciliation, on tariff reconciliation in Europe, but is similar action possible on climate? And again, we would love to hear your perspective on a lot of these questions about the future of multilateral cooperation and climate diplomacy in this context.
Sure. Thanks very much, Johnson and Caroline, for having this. I would try to deliver on what Henry Paul just said as sort of a new and perhaps younger generation perspective. Although, just full disclosure, my first climate COP was already 15 years ago in Durban, South Africa. So just in that regard, Ambassador Shaikh, the whole Paris Agreement, I just want to underline, started actually in Durban in South Africa. That's the critical meeting that gave the mandate to deliver the Paris Agreement. Let me try to make two very brief points. Number one, I just want to add in my perspective on the challenges faced by multilateralism and the severe lack of political trust among countries now. And all of this, of course, posing a very daunting challenge for climate action in the next few years. Caroline has already mentioned the significant climate retreat in the US. And on top of that, we are seeing persistent political and economic tensions between the US and China. And that tension, unfortunately, will persist in the foreseeable future, adding further pressure for international cooperation. We've seen from the last COP in Baku, Azerbaijan, the significant gap and lack of trust between the global north and the global south on particularly the issue of climate finance, commitment, and delivery. And if I were to compare where we are now under the second Trump administration and where we were as a global community during President Trump's first term, I'm also sensing a lack of collective energy from much of the rest of the world getting together to defend climate action and multilateralism. Colleagues in Canada may well recall what happened during the first Trump administration. 3 countries stepped up to create a ministerial process called Ministerial on Climate Action, MOCA. And these 3 countries are Canada, China, and the European Union. We are about half a year into the second Trump administration, yet we haven't seen an effective, decisive response from this group of countries. I think that just very much underlines the challenges faced by global climate action. My second point, which haven't been touched by other panelists, is on the economics of climate action. I very much agree with the prevailing narrative that we have seen over the last few years, which is if a country were to embark on climate action, it is ultimately in that country's economic interest. I don't think that point can or should be challenged at all. But at the same time, just over recent years, I'm also seeing the economic promises of climate action being too politicized, even inflated too much. What I mean by this is if you look at kind of the recent global consensus on the economics behind climate action, there seems to be a few assumptions. Number one, there is economic benefit behind climate action. Number two, every country can and should access that economic benefit. And number three, the way to access and benefit economically from climate action is by imposing tariffs. And if a country has the fiscal capacity, pour money in a rather unselected way into low carbon green sector. And number four, taking all these actions as if one country on the planet does not exist, and that country is China, the powerhouse that produces about 80% of the global solar panel, 70% of wind turbines, and around 60% of battery and electric vehicles. So the point that I'm driving here is that economic consensus behind climate action, then we need to be much more carefully scrutinized over the next few years so that we avoid inflate the economic promises. Because I do see a risk behind that inflated economic promises actually undermining the very necessary conditions that we would need to progress global climate action. Fueling, for example, economic nationalism, isolationism, and protection, right? So the tension between the economic argument, and the very multilateralism that we need to preserve. How do we manage that tension? By creating a slightly more nuanced economic narrative. I think that is going to be very, very important for all the countries in the world. Let me maybe just leave it here, Johnson, and turn it back to you.
Sure thing. I mean, we'll dive into a lot of this further into the discussion, but I did want to also bring in, last but not least, Alden on this first initial opener, which is looking again at the multilateral system and climate diplomacy within that. I mean, we've heard about the Chinese perspective, the global South perspective, and now we would like to get a bit more understanding of where the U.S. stands on all of this, particularly under this administration, given its interests in the fossil fuel sector, as well as its current activities with regards to the climate multilateral architecture. So if you could speak to a lot of these questions from an American point of view, I think that would be of value.
Sure, and thank you. And just echoing Li Shou's comment, I'm not sure I represent the new generation. I mean, he was at the COP in Durban. I was at the formation in 1989 of the IPCC and all the things that have followed. So I'm bloodied but unbowed. My wife gave me a pin on my 50th birthday that said, "Thou shalt not commit adulthood." And I've tried to live into that saying for the rest of my life. So I'm still young at heart. But let me just start with a little context here, which I think is important for the climate issue. The climate emergency is the greatest challenge humanity has ever confronted. There's no doubt about that. It's existential. It can eliminate huge swaths of species and ecosystems and communities around the world. It requires transformation of every sector of our economy at a pace and a scale that's unparalleled in human history. So we shouldn't be surprised that it's challenging. I mean, this is our burden to bear, and we have to acknowledge the difficulty of it while we also redouble efforts to achieve it. And I would say that one of the disconnects here, building on what Li Shou said, is when it comes to any true cost benefit of climate action, all the analysis shows that much greater climate mitigation is needed and supported and in the interests of people all around the world. And the damages that we're experiencing are going to outweigh any costs of investment in the transition to a clean economy. That being said, special interests, the fossil fuel industry, the petrostates, others, not just in the US, but around the world, have polluted this space since the beginning of the negotiations. They targeted the US in particular in the mid-1990s around the Kyoto Protocol. I remember the head of ExxonMobil going to China, India, other countries, telling them they should not accept any binding emission reduction commitments because it would impede their economic growth, and then funding multi-million-dollar TV campaigns in the US showing China, India, Brazil, other countries being cut from a world map and saying America shouldn't ratify Kyoto because developing countries weren't taking action. I mean, talk about cynical and hypocritical and two-faced, but very effective strategy. And they've been doing this for decades. My former group, Union of Concerned Scientists, had documented the multi-decade disinformation campaign of this industry. They are fighting for their survival, and they know it. And they're willing to bow to any tactic and low strategy to get there. So that's the second thing, is the public interest versus the special interest. The third thing is that even before the re-election of Donald Trump to a second term and the US withdrawal from Paris, the world was facing three tremendous gaps in this process. The first is well known. It's a mitigation ambition gap. We're nowhere near the scale of emission reductions we need globally to achieve the 1.5 Celsius temperature goal, or even the 2-degree temperature limit that previously was the goal. Much more action is needed. The second gap is finance mobilization. We heard about that in the near breakdown of the negotiations in Belém, where the need is obviously in the trillions for the developing countries to decarbonize their economies while building resilience to the impacts of climate change. And yet the most we could squeeze out of those negotiations by 2035 was 300 billion a year, which when you account for inflation and the rising increase of the the World Bank and other MDBs is not much of a change for the developed countries. The third gap, and this doesn't get as much coverage as the first two, is the adaptation, resilience, loss, and damage gap, the inability to build capacity to respond to the impacts that are coming at us. Even if we went to net zero emissions by tomorrow, it's still baked into the system. The climate impacts are going to get worse over the coming decades, and we're not doing anything near. So the Brazilian presidency is challenged because they need to address all three of these gaps simultaneously, and they need to do it in a way that deals with the withdrawal of the world's largest economy and second biggest emitter from the table. The US is not even sending a delegation to Bonn next week for the first time in the history of this process. So that is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity because, as Caro said, the US has been an uneven player since the beginning of this process. George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, blocked adoption of any binding commitments in the original Rio framework. The US demanded a number of features of the Kyoto Protocol, such as emissions trading, use of land use sinks, and other features, and then had no strategy to ratify and join Kyoto. And of course, Donald Trump has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement twice. So the world is getting tired of the US behavior, but it's not a shock and a surprise, and we need to deal with it. The good news is that governors, mayors, business leaders representing over 60% of the US economy and over half of our population are part of the America is All In coalition, which was launched when I was at the Marrakesh COP in 2016 after Donald Trump first unexpectedly won the presidency. And we had to come up with a response. Those actors represent the third largest economy in the world if they were a separate country after just the US and China. So they're a powerful force, but of course, their influence is limited on the international stage. They can do a lot at home in terms of domestic emission reductions. They can't compensate for the US withdrawal on climate finance or US engagement in multilateral diplomacy. So the final thing I'll say is that well, the landscape is definitely challenging. I echo everything the ambassador said and the other three panelists as well in terms of the landscape. There are opportunities here, and it's a real challenge to the rest of the world to show that they're going to prioritize maintaining multilateral cooperation to address the climate emergency, because that's what's required. This is not a beggar thy neighbor kind of issue where countries can go it alone. We're all, as I've said many times, we're all in the same boat, and pointing fingers and saying your end of the lifeboat is sinking is just crazy. So that's the challenge and the opportunity. And that being said, I also have said that, well, the international landscape can provide impetus and coordination and cooperation. The real action on the ground is driven by capitals, industries, investors, et cetera. I said last year in Baku, when people were challenging whether we needed a different forum than the UNFCCC and the COPs to address this issue, I said the COPs are the place where we come once a year to hold up our mirror to ourselves and how well are we doing as a species in addressing this crisis. And if the image that's reflected in the mirror is ugly, it doesn't make a lot of sense to blame the mirror. It's the lack of political will in the major countries, the lack of leadership on the international stage and domestically that's the real problem. And trying to find another forum, whether it's the G20, the Security Council, the Climate Council that Brazil is talking about creating in the UN system, that's going to not solve the problem. Wherever you go, you bring yourself with you. And wherever forum we create, you will have the same actors, the same powers, the same fossil fuel industry disinformation campaign at work. So we have to be adult about this and realize what the real challenges are. And multilateral cooperation is a key part of the puzzle. It's not the only piece, or maybe even the most important piece. It's no substitute for political will and leadership. But as my longtime friend Al Gore likes to say, political will is a renewable resource.
Well, thank you for that, Alden. And, I think political will is something that a lot of people have difficulty finding when it comes to the current multilateral system as we know it, particularly as we have the G7 coming upon us and the US president visiting and discussing these issues with other G7 leaders. And in that respect, as we're heading towards the road towards the COP30 with Brazil in the lead, what specifically is the role that the G7 and G20 can do in upholding and reinforcing multilateral climate commitments, given all these issues that we've all discussed so far? Is there specific action or specific areas where there's room for optimism, particularly this year in the COP30 context? And perhaps, Carol, you can discuss that from your perspective, having been in this space in Canada, and given that Canada is in the G7 chair at this current moment. So perhaps you can start us.
Sure, although I do not have the same COP track record as my colleagues Alden and Li-Shuo, but yes, I can speak to the Canadian context. With Canada hosting this year, I have to say it was a little bit of a complicated moment politically, notwithstanding the geopolitics that we've been discussing so far, because of the Liberal leadership race, because of then the federal election, which has resulted in the fact that we have not had a climate and energy and environment ministerial meeting before the Leaders Summit. Why this matters and why, we typically look to these ministerials is that it usually is one of the first events on the diplomatic calendar every year when it comes to climate, sending a bit of a signal to the rest of the world in terms of where the world's largest polluters and richest economies are at in terms of their contribution to the next COP. This year, I think particularly as after what my colleagues referred to in Baku, which truly was a debacle and really fragmented the already very thin level of trust within countries in that inside the compromise that is the Paris Agreement, because of the failure to commit to a climate finance goal that meets the needs of countries in the global south. And I must emphasize here that is not only a question of morality here and of justice, but it's also a question of making the Paris Agreement possible, right? How can we expect countries in the global south to transition away from fossil fuels when some of these countries are highly dependent on revenue, both at a national GDP level, but also when it comes to government revenue, especially when countries in the global north, including Canada, are not moving forward on that commitment. And so finance is not only a question of justice, it's a question of what makes the transition possible. And there are other barriers here that we need to think about, and Li-Shuo did mention some of them when it comes to trade, for instance, that maybe I can allude to later on, but just for the context of this ministerial and the signals that would have been very useful to hear. We are in an ambition enhancement cycle within the Paris Agreement, which means that countries are submitting new climate targets this year. We have not seen many nationally determined contributions. They're called NDCs so far. So a signal from the G7 would have been very important. It would have been really important for those countries to talk about how we would go to bridging that gap between the 300 billion that was committed to in Baku to the 1.3 trillion in needs that have been assessed. And this recommitment to not only climate multilateralism, but to the transition away from fossil fuels, which was a landmark decision in Dubai, where, again, from a fairness perspective and a feasibility perspective, we should be expecting the G7 to move first and fast. So we did not get that signal during a ministerial. And I think we, given what we've discussed on the destructive approach of the current US administration to climate diplomacy, likely will not see this from the leaders. I do as well want to stress from a Canadian perspective the really disappointing first moves of Prime Minister Carney when it comes to making this transition a reality. And in fact, it is an opportunity for us in this moment when our sovereignty is threatened to diversify away not only from volatile commodities, but also from an increasingly belligerent trading partner. We have not seen Prime Minister Carney seize that opportunity. Quite the contrary. We see a really worrying backtrack when it comes to the reality of fossil fuels being at the core of the climate crisis, and the idea of large projects such as Pan-Canadian pipelines being put forward, which is really worrying. And so while this should be a moment where Canada shows a backbone with the US and builds coalition of the willing, sharing that, we are still in, I am not sure that's what we'll be seeing, unfortunately, in Kananaskis. And to be clear, we should be expecting Prime Minister Carney to show climate leadership internationally. The G7 will be truly a test of that, given his past credentials and his words on the issue. But the invitation of Donald Trump in Canada and some of his moves on the national scene do not bode well. Where there's opportunity and where we'd like to see movement is on the sidelines, perhaps, of the G7 with some of the other leaders who have been brought into the fold to share with those more regressive forces the importance of climate action, not only from, again, a social, environmental perspective, but from an economic one in this moment.
All right. Well, I think all of that's well taken, and we'll all have to see what ultimately comes about over the next coming days. On this question about the COP30 presidency with Brazil in the driver's seat and what can be done specifically through the G7 or the G20 format, I perhaps want to bring in again Li Shuo to provide some perspective on how China is engaging these questions, particularly with a more non-cooperative relationship with the US, and in what ways it has contributed to reinforcing or advancing climate commitments in the COP framework. If you could share your views on that.
Sure, Johnson. Let me say two things. The first thing is, of course, in the run-up to COP30, which will be hosted by Brazil. I just want to note the very extensive and high-level engagement that has happened over the last 12 months or so between the Chinese government and the Brazilian government. President Xi was in Brazil late last year for the G20 summit. And then President Xi will be going to Brazil very soon in July for the BRICS summit. We also sent these two leaders, having exchanges earlier in this year. President Lula also visited Beijing in April. So the point that I want to make here is I do think the bilateral relationship between China and the COP presidency will be one that is worth watching. I'm also hoping that China will provide strong support for Brazil's COP agenda. And by doing so, I think what I'm hoping for is that the emergence of kind of global South unity will bring enough political power to the multilateral space and help us and help climate multilateralism to progress in light of an otherwise very difficult international political situation. The second thing, which is kind of going back to G7 and to a less extent on G20, I just want to pose a very simple question, yet a very difficult one, I recognize, for countries to respond to. And that question is really when, for our purposes, right, advancing global climate action, Do different countries, for example, within the G7, need China or not? And I say this question is not easy to answer because just over the last couple of weeks, we have seen, for example, from Washington, on certain days, the sentiment seems to be, we don't need China. We can afford complete decoupling with China, and we can afford triple-digit tariffs on Chinese goods and products. Yet on other days, the sentiment seems to be, we actually do need China, rare earths and critical minerals. So where do you draw the line? What is the the message here on reliance on China? And I raise this question also, of course, noting the dominating role of China in global clean tech supply chain. If the answer is no, we do not need China, then what is actually the alternative and convincing vision to supply the various domestic decarbonization processes? The IRA attempted to answer that question, and it is, of course, in severe jeopardy now in Congress. So I do want to, urge all of us to think about that question very carefully, because I do think that the answer to that single question determining the global discourse on climate action over the next few years.
Can I jump in on that?
Right, well,
Could I?
oh, sure, of course, Ambassador.
Very soon I'll have to leave. So let me just say that I will answer that question on behalf of South Africa. I will not go towards BRICS, but I will say no country in the world can be removed from the map. And I think in particular, China cannot be removed from the map. Every country has to find a way in which it has to relate to every other country in this interdependent world that we live in. And I think there is a general acknowledgement that the world is now interdependent. Of course, this does not mean that we must accept the world with all the ills that comes with that interdependence. Because part of that interdependence has led to, as Lee correctly says, the kind of carbonization of the world, which is fungible, and all the necessary actions that we need to address a cleaner planet. So, in that, you cannot exclude China from that. And I don't think anyone has argued for that exclusion. So I can tell you off the record, working on Shatama, we in South Africa have been engaging counterparts, and in particular Canada, to say you have to get an understanding with China on all of the issues. And I like the Chinese approach insofar as any disagreements that you have in regard to China, because we signed up to as HP so wonderfully put it, as we all signed up to the WTO, whatever disagreements we have in respect of each other's trade policies, the WTO is a place that we must solve it. But I think what can help in the process is that if we quieten down what I call megaphone diplomacy and engage in more constructive diplomacy to address the problems that exist, so that we could, because there will always be problems in life, always. And particularly as the world is shifting, there's going to be greater problems that calls on greater, not lesser cooperation, greater cooperation. And I think in that regard, I think everyone would have to make peace with each other in the end if we want to solve this problem, and be able to find each other's needs in each other's actions. And I think that is what we will advance. And that is what the G7 and forums like the G20 and forums like BRICS and Global North, Global South Cooperation does. It lays the basis for better understanding for the need of international cooperation. Because again, as JP and as Alden has said, and Caroline touched on it, without international cooperation, we're in a disaster. And I think everyone recognizes that. So, Lee, I hope I jumped in on your question there.
I think this is a question that most of our panelists are keen on addressing. Perhaps, Alden, you could come in and address some of that. And with respect to also just in general, the COP30 for this year and the challenges that will be testing Brazil's presidency on the road to that summit. So, Alden, if you may.
Sure. Let me just respond. And Lisho and I have discussed this in the past. So I'm not saying anything new to him, but for your audience, this is a very challenging issue. I mean, the U.S.-China tension has been longstanding. It's bipartisan in the U.S. And you got to understand that there are forces in the U.S. looking at technologies that were invented in U.S. national laboratories with expenditure of public money, where China has done a much better job of commercializing and driving down the costs and organizing the supply chains. So I think there's a balance here between wanting to benefit from China's experience, manufacturing prowess, and technical ability, at the same time not saying that China is the supplier to the entire world of these technologies at the expense of domestic industries, workers, communities, et cetera. That's the just transition aspect of this. And it's not just the US and Europe, although those three powers are the ones sort of circling in the cage with each other now. But it's also the global South. And I've heard this at all the negotiating forums in recent years, that there's a feeling that it's not just China, it's the EU and the US dominating this landscape for investment, for jobs, for low-cost capital to decarbonize their economies. And Africa and other places face much higher costs and challenges in benefiting. I've heard the figure that 40% global renewable capacity is in Africa, and it's only getting 3% of global renewable energy investment. So that's just one example. But on the larger question, I echo what Caro said about the G7. Mark Carney has obviously made a decision to go for unity rather than ambition. We're not going to change his mind on that. You'll see in the statement he put out last week, they mentioned a few areas that are climate related, such as joint responses to wildfires, fortifying critical mineral supply chains, and catalyzing enormous private investment to build stronger infrastructure, which are all code for things we need to do on climate without calling them climate. Whether that'll work with Donald Trump, I have no idea. We'll find out soon enough. But it's important to note that the other G7 leaders need to signal clearly, no matter what the outcome is of the summit and what Trump says during it or after, committed to G7 leadership and commitments on both domestic emission reductions and financial scaling up for international cooperation, regardless of what the U.S. is doing. The G20 is more complicated, and I sympathize with South Africa's role because it's not just the U.S. Brazil had a hard time last year with other players, including the Saudis, Russia, Argentina, and even on some issues, China and India. So, this is a much more complicated space. And even if you had a Democratic administration now, it would not be easy to get the kind of cooperation we need in the G20. That being said, I think there are some aspects where it may be possible, such as resilience, the threat of climate change to global financial stability and other fronts, for there to be some progress. But then you come into next year when the US will be chairing the G20. So is that a null set? Are we just trying to hop over next year to 2027 when it might be the UK or Korea or someone else taking the lead and just hope that Donald Trump doesn't get it together to host a G20 summit the way he didn't host a G7 summit in 2020, the last year of his first term? I don't know. Caro and I and others will be struggling with that question once we get through this next year and need to prepare for that. The BRICS, I think, is very interesting because under Brazil, the BRICS is a much more energized, ambitious space on climate action. If you look at the declaration that came out on climate change and sustainable development at the end of May, that's the basis for the Leaders Summit, July 5th and 6th, there is a lot in there beyond what BRICS has ever done in this area. Whether that will be enough to drive global cooperation going into BLEM remains to be seen, but it's a very interesting space that we need to pay more attention to. And finally, I would just say we need to look at all the forums, not just the multilateral ones like the UNFCCC, BRICS, G7, G20. We need to look at sectoral spaces like the Clean Energy Ministerial Summit in Busan, South Korea in August, or the Methane Partnership, or other spaces that drive the response in the real world to these issues. We need to look at coalitions of the willing, the Chilean-German Climate Club, or the Coalition of Trade Ministers for Climate Action, Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, those kind of spaces. And we need to look at regional spaces. ASEAN was mentioned, but also the Africa Climate Leaders Summit that Ethiopia will be hosting in September, or some of the Latin American spaces where they're focused on biodiversity and the Amazon. We need to look at all these spaces and make them a fit for purpose and figure out what they each can do as part of the mosaic or the global infrastructure here. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Johnson.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I do want to bring Henry Paul in, given his experience navigating the UN system and through the different coalitions of the willing that we've heard mentioned over the past number of decades. And when we're talking about the G7, the G20, or new organizations like the BRICS, how can the global North engage global South perspectives in this much more diverse multilateral institutional landscape? I'm not sure if you can tackle that entire question in a simple way, Henry Paul. Let's go ahead.
Yeah, there's not a simple answer to that. I think that generally we have to look, Alden was talking about spaces. I think we have to look at each opportunity and see if we can push something useful in various fora, if we can mobilize people, if we can take decisions that will lead to actions. And you have to look at it piece by piece. And the same goes for coalitions of the willing. And I would add also the diversity of partnerships. Of course, when we think climate change, we think in particular about national governments. But there are also other levels of government which are involved, including cities. And we've seen that big time, cities getting involved on climate issues. So, and of course, that's not to talk about the private sector and so on. So you have to look at coalition of different partnerships as well. So again, I don't have a simple answer to that. You just have to look at each opportunity and engineer something that you think you might push usefully. This being said, Alden stole my thunder in a way when earlier he said it's all the same countries everywhere. Sometimes people say, we should scrap the UN and replace it by something else. And my reply to that is, well, it's going to be the same 193 countries. So whether they're sitting at the UN, at the G20, at the G7, or elsewhere in the BRICS, is the same countries. So it does make indeed for a complicated landscape. But I would like to come back to the G7 issue because it's the next big ticket item, and it's happening just a few days. We're just a few days away. As a footnote, I was involved in the G7 summit in CAN-Rac some 21 years ago in 2002. And at the time, different times, the big topic was Africa. Africa had just launched the NEPAD, the New Economic Partnership for Africa. And Prime Minister Chrétien at the time had said, we're going to mobilize the G7 in support of Africa, in support of what the Africans want. And that was a big moment. And we put, political leadership and resources into it. Anyway, I just couldn't miss the opportunity to refer to CAN-Rac 2 decades ago. But back to this upcoming G7, it's obviously a very tricky situation. How to advance on climate change while managing Donald Trump. And here, we've seen various attempts by Canada to try to weave in issues that have something to do with climate change and wildfires, energy, and so on. It may be smart. We will see at the very end if it's useful or not. I'll be looking personally for two things out of the G7, whether or not they happen. First of all, language. We practice multilateralism, so we know how important language is in words. What will be the statement? Will there be a common statement on climate change, or maybe not? We remember that in Charlevoix, there were basically two separate statements on climate change, one by the six and one by the United States. Will we have the same thing this time around? That'll be interesting to see. And of course, to what extent will there be a recommitment? So language. But I will also be looking at the following. Are there decisions or initiatives that will have been put forward that may lead to useful action? In a way, I'd be ready to compromise a bit on the language if we have decisions and actions follow up. So that's what I will be looking at. I can't say I'm hopeful at this point in time. We will have to see. But that he was once a UN envoy on climate change. Time to deliver.
Okay, well, I perhaps do want to bring Carol in to discuss some of what's all been brought up so far. I mean, we've talked about ways in which the G7 and other global north economies can amplify a lot of the priorities on the climate file of the global south. Do you see room for optimism on that this year, especially with G20 in the hands of South Africa, with Brazil leading in terms of COP? And, especially with regards to what Réseau has been talking about in terms of a inclusive discussion table when it comes to China's role in the global environmental diplomacy space. All of these are things that I think we don't have easy answers to.
Yeah, I think maybe to start by answering Lishuo's question most directly on, whether countries, Canada and the G7 can live without integration with China. I think the clear answer is no, both from an economic perspective, but also from a climate perspective. Alden has spoken very eloquently about, how we cannot solve this issue without multilateralism, without global cooperation. We shouldn't erase anyone off the map, as His Excellency has said. I think one key risk for the G7 this year is that opposition to China, or at least competition with China economically, in large part driven by the bipartisan consensus in the US that Alden mentioned, is what becomes the lowest common denominator driving decarbonization action in the G7, whether that's on supply chains, whether that's on transition minerals. So I think we have to be very careful there on that becoming the thing that brings together the G7 on climate, because it would be very disruptive for the other layers of the onion that is the climate diplomacy architecture, so to speak, whether we think about the G7, the G20, but as well the multilateral spaces. And I think, again, here, there's an opportunity for realignment that I was very hopeful to see Canada seize. During the campaign, we saw initially in French, we say la main tendue from Carney proposing a bilateral meeting with Xi. But that rapidly changed as the days passed and some of the conversation shifted a little bit. Yet again, on climate, this is absolutely essential and has been fundamental in the past to upholding the Paris Agreement. Lishuo mentioned MOCA, which we are not clear on whether that space is still active, the Ministerial on Climate Action, bringing together Canada, the EU, and China. Also want to remind us that Canada and China have a historic accomplishment on environmental diplomacy together, which is the signature of the Kunming-Montreal global biodiversity framework. And so I am really hoping that in our efforts to maintain our sovereignty in the face of the United States, we seize those opportunities to diversify our allyships and our coalitions. I think in some way we are seeing that, but not necessarily with China. Prime Minister Carney has invited now a multitude of other world leaders. We're talking about President Zelensky from Ukraine, the Australian Prime Minister Albanese, Brazilian President Lula, South African President Ramaphosa, South Korean President Lee Jae-myung, and Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum. So perhaps here we are seeing an effort to position Canada as a convener in its role as a middle power that could in some ways counterbalance the Trump administration. But the question is, will we be hearing those signals on the sidelines that Alden has been mentioning around the importance of climate action and commitment to it? And maybe just a final thought on trade, which Li Shuo mentioned. I think trade is really right now a key driving force and one that is percolating increasingly in the climate change space. And again, opportunity for realignment here with those tariffs that are pissing literally everyone off, for countries to build new commercial relationships and alliances and rethink the international trade architecture, which as it is currently designed, again, is not only very unfair, but very ineffective when it comes to driving climate outcomes, whether we think about WTO trade rules, whether we think about some of the measures deemed unilateral measures by some parties that are driving tension inside the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change system. We need industrial policy. Let us be very clear. The question is, how do we design it in a way that is internationalist and takes into account our global commitment to climate action and helps us preserve the planet. And so I think here there's an opportunity, namely on just transition negotiations happening within the UNFCCC. And I'm truly hoping to see countries like Canada in their roles as middle power build new alliances and coalitions to drive these outcomes and tackle some of the obsolete ways our global infrastructure has been made yet.
All right. Thanks, Carol. And I will. Oh,
I gotta go.
of course.
Could
No
I
worries.
leave? I want to
Ambassador.
thank the panel for excellent. I mean, I wish when I grow up I'd be as polished as all of your panelists. I will keep trying. Thank you very much. Such wonderful
Pleasure
views,
to have you.
everybody.
Ambassador, I say never grow up.
Never grow up. I love that about adulthood. I wrote it down. Thou shalt not commit adulthood. I love that.
It's the 11th commandment. Yep.
It's the 11th commandment. Bye-bye, Eldon. Take care, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Take care. All right. So with that said, I did want to, because we are pressing a bit on time, so I'll combine perhaps our last few questions together, and perhaps leaving on an optimistic or more optimistic note, because we're talking about ways to mediate between a lot of the differences that exist at the moment between whether that's the US and China, between the G7 and the G20, the global North, global South. Perhaps, Li Shuo, you can speak to some of the bright spots of cooperation that we do have reason to be optimistic about. You know, I know that the EU and China are one area that we've seen progress on, and you know, there's more to that beyond just the big actors, as others have said. So happy to hear your views on that.
Sure, Johnson. On the EU-China front, indeed, I mean, this has become a much more complex bilateral relationship. You know, the political, geopolitical, and economic differences between the two sides, I think in recent years have imposed some challenges in their climate cooperation. So I just want to be very honest about that. This is just yet another reflection of the global geopolitical frictions and how that tend to hinder climate cooperation. Having that said, the two sides are indeed intensifying their consultations in the run-up to a high-level EU-China bilateral summit late in July. And I'm hoping that some clear and strong signal on climate change will come out of that summit. Let me also go back very briefly to your previous question, which is how to bridge the global north and the global south. I want to underline what Alden mentioned, namely the very impressive effort done by the Brazilian government in its leadership role this year in the BRICS forces. Indeed, quite a number of recent deliverables on the climate track of the BRICS summit. Without going into all the details, I would just say this is probably the best and the strongest effort in unifying, if not the entire global south, at least a large part of the global south, in particular the most important, the largest members of the global south. And as part of this effort, bringing the global south, if not in substance, at least in style, to as close to the global north as possible. And so the question here is really, can the Brazilian government inherit what they have delivered with the BRICS members, take that deliverable forward to COP30, and get some of the deliverables adopted or agreed in a multilateral setting, and having buy-in from the global north. I think that's basically the overall strategy. If they can achieve that, that's, I mean, just to go back to your question, Johnson, that's one way to bridge these two camps. And we should, if this can be achieved, even just to some extent, we should not underestimate the effort and this achievement.
Thanks, Li. Perhaps I can get Alden to comment on this last question we have here on this matter of mediating the differences between the developed world and the global south on climate change issues, and perhaps in the context of the G7, given that is what is ahead of us in the coming days. What are your expectations, both for that and the future of climate governance and multilateral cooperation on these issues?
Well, as we discussed, all these spaces have their challenges, and I think the G7 will know very soon the outcome of Prime Minister Carney's experiment here about trying to mollify the President of the United States and project unity. We'll see what that actually delivers. But as I've said before, the global north and the global south is one way to look at this. It's not the only way. You can actually look at, from an equity lens, the global north in the global south in terms of high polluting countries, such as some of the Middle Eastern countries, or Singapore or others that have very high per capita emissions. We really need to break down the sort of assumption that all of this has to be dealt with in conventional geopolitics, because that may not deliver the outcomes we need. So the work that Carol and others are doing in Climate Action Network around the Just Transition work program and unifying North and South voices around the common need for a more equitable economic system and a social safety net and industrial policy and other issues, I think is essential. Because the only time in this 35-year process where we've made big leaps forward is when you've got a truly North-South coalition standing up to the fossil fuel polluters. And usually that involves leadership from the developed countries of the European Union and the UK sometimes, some of the others, often not the US at the beginning, but coming in later. It involves the small island states, the least developed countries and others, the most vulnerable countries who are sort of the moral conscience of this whole issue. But then it always comes down to the big emerging economies, India, China, Brazil, South Africa. Where do they swing? And when they swing with the pro-climate ambition side, as we saw in Paris, we get things like the 1.5°C temperature goal and the 5-year ratchet mechanism to build ambition. Where they don't, we get breakdown, as in the Kyoto Protocol, with major countries either not ratifying to begin with or dropping out of the second commitment period and rendering it useless. So that is the challenge, is to break down north-south lines and unite around the common interest of humanity, particularly lower and middle income people around the world, in having an effective climate solution. I'm hoping Liu is right, that Brazil will pivot from its successful BRICS summit in July to taking that energy into Belém and bringing in some northern partners. That's the ideal outcome. That is a challenging landscape given the trade, security, and other issues that we've mentioned.
All right. And perhaps, Henry Paul, given your benefit of hindsight supporting the G7 summit in Damascus 20 years ago, and how we're facing that very same set of issues today, where you come in on this issue and sort of your optimistic perspective, perhaps on where we stand on climate cooperation and multilateralism post the G7 summit.
Well, first of all, it was very encouraging to hear what Liu had to say about the leadership that Brazil is showing. That's very encouraging. And I was going to say about bridging. You know, there's bridging between the North and the South, but there's bridging, as we just heard from some of your comments, there's bridging within the South, and there's bridging within the North to do. And Canada is struggling with this latter part these very days on the G7. But to end on the broader issues of future cooperation on climate change, and to make the link with what I was saying at the beginning, where we're facing rough times in terms of multilateralism and cooperation and so on. I would like to think that after a few more years of going through chaos and the experience that we will have with not following rules, with not cooperating on major issues and common challenges and so on, I would like to think that after a few years of experimenting with a little bit of chaos in this shifting order, it might be that we come back to our senses and tell ourselves, after all, okay, multilateralism, cooperation, rules and norms, that is the way to go. We just experimented a few very bad years and it wasn't successful. So I'm not predicting that this will happen, but I would like to put it as a possibility out there that it might happen. And basically to encourage us, as the ambassador was saying at the beginning, we have agency. So let's carry on through these difficult years on climate and other issues of common good, reinventing ourselves, innovating, being opportunistic and strategic. And we might come out stronger a few years down the road. I don't want to be naive. I don't want to paint a rosy picture, but I think that there's a possibility out there, and let's build on that.
All right. Well, I'll leave the final words to Caro as our co-organizer here between FPD and Climate Action Network Canada on what her outlook or assessment of the G7's outcomes may be and what that means for the future of climate governance and multilateralism. So, Caro, I live with you.
Thanks so much, Johnson. I'll be short. I feel like we touched on this subject, perhaps tangentially. I think many of us will be keeping our eyes peeled for what happens during the G7. I think I do want to mention that this is a significant test of Prime Minister Carney's international climate leadership. It is also a test about how the G7 and other leaders and powers are going to position themselves and coalesce again in this moment of realignment and changing world order. Cannot agree more. And I was hoping that we would finish on the note of hope that Monsieur Normandin invited us to. These are scary times with devastating consequences, impacts for people, for communities. We are thinking of them and holding them close to our hearts. At the same time, I think we are in a moment of transformation, and with transformation comes opportunity to tackle the things that have not been working and that have led us to the intersecting crises that we are faced with right now. Thanks, everyone. This conversation felt extremely generative. I learned a lot, and am very grateful for the opportunity to have it.
All right. And on that hopeful note, I would like to thank all of our distinguished panelists who we all learned quite a great deal from today, as well as the High Commissioner for his views earlier on in the session. So I do encourage you to follow the work of all of our relevant organizations, including IPD, Climate Action Network Canada, as well as those of us participating from various parts of the world on this panel. So with that said, I leave you all to look towards the G7 on a hopefully more optimistic note, as we all hope to do so. All right. Thank you, everyone. And
thank you, everyone.
we'll
Goodbye.
speak again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Goodbye.